She was 8 months pregnant, and then she vanished. Her car was found by the river. Her phone, recovered. Her body, never. And when her billionaire husband stood in front of the cameras, begging for help, he smiled. But what no one knew, not the police, not the media, not even him, was that his dead wife was watching the broadcast from a secret safe house. She wasn't gone. She was waiting. Because the moment he smiled on camera, her trap started counting down. Stay till the end. You won't believe how her last message destroyed him. And hey, if you love smart thrillers where the truth hits harder than revenge, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. It helps more people discover stories like this one. The cameras loved Derek Brennan. At 38 years old, he stood at the podium like a man carved from grief itself. Designer suit perfectly tailored, hair artfully disheveled, eyes red-rimmed but focused. Behind him, FBI agents stood in formation, their presence lending gravity to the moment. "Please," Derek said, his voice breaking at precisely the right moment. "If anyone has seen my wife, Madison, or has any information about her whereabouts, come forward. She's 8 months pregnant with our daughter, our little hope." He paused, looking directly into the camera lens. For just half a second, the corner of his mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, just a flicker of something that didn't match the tears on his cheeks. The press conference had been running on every major network for 4 days straight. Madison Claire Brennan, 32 years old, former chief communications officer of Gene Lux Pharmaceuticals, had vanished without a trace. Her luxury SUV found abandoned near Riverside Bridge, her purse floating in the water below. Her phone shattered on the rocks. No body recovered. The story had everything America loved: a beautiful pregnant woman, a billionaire husband, a mystery that felt like it belonged in a thriller novel. Social media exploded with theories. True crime podcasts dedicated entire episodes to the case. Derek's face appeared on every morning show, every news channel, every front page. "My wife was struggling," Derek told Anderson Cooper that evening, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. The pregnancy had been difficult. Hormones, mood swings. Her therapist can confirm she'd been having dark thoughts. America's heart broke for him. Gene Lux Pharmaceutical stock rose 17%. 200 miles away, in a small safe house with blackout curtains and FBI surveillance equipment humming in the corner, Madison Brennan sat on a worn couch, very pregnant, watching her husband perform on a muted television screen. She pressed a hand to her swollen belly, feeling hope kick against her palm. On screen, Derek wiped away another tear. The same calculated gesture he'd used when his co-founder Marcus Vance had supposedly committed suicide 3 years ago. The same practiced sorrow he'd displayed at board meetings when discussing the 47 patients who died in Gene Lux's clinical trials. Madison had studied that face for 7 years of marriage. She knew every micro-expression, every tell, every manipulation. And now the whole world was about to learn what she'd known for months: that Derek Brennan was a murderer, that he'd planned to kill her, that he'd underestimated her completely. FBI Special Agent Rachel Foster entered the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. She was 41, sharp-eyed, with the kind of competence that came from 15 years investigating white-collar crimes. She handed Madison one of the cups and sat down beside her. "He's good," Foster said, watching Derek on screen. "I'll give him that." "He's had practice," Madison replied. Her voice was calm, but her hand shook slightly as she raised the coffee to her lips. "Marcus Vance wasn't the first person Derek killed. Just the first one I could prove." Foster glanced at her. "You holding up okay?" Madison touched her belly again. Hope was due in 3 weeks. 3 weeks until she could hold her daughter, could finally breathe freely, could stop looking over her shoulder every second of every day. "Ask me again when he's in handcuffs," Madison said. On the television, Derek's face filled the screen. He was speaking about the nursery he'd designed, the name Hope painted in soft pink letters above the crib, the future he'd planned for his family. Every word a lie, every tear a performance, every smile a threat. 7 days, Foster said quietly. In 7 days, your dead man switched triggers. Everything you documented, everything you recorded, every piece of evidence goes public. And then we move in. Madison nodded. 7 days of watching Derek play the grieving husband. 7 days of America falling in love with a monster. 7 days of staying hidden, staying silent, staying alive. She'd spent 8 months planning this. 8 months documenting Gene Lux's fraud, recording Derek's conversations, building an airtight case that would destroy him completely. 8 months preparing to disappear so thoroughly that even Derek would believe she was dead, because that was the only way to trap him. Derek thought he'd won, thought he'd eliminated the problem, thought he could charm his way through interviews while his lawyers buried evidence and his PR team controlled the narrative. He didn't know that Madison had left breadcrumbs, digital breadcrumbs that would lead straight to the truth. He didn't know that she was watching. And he definitely didn't know that in 7 days his entire world would collapse. On screen, Derek smiled that perfect, practiced smile. Madison smiled back at the television. "Got you," she whispered. Detective Sarah Matthews had seen enough missing person cases to know when something didn't add up. She stood in the Brennans' $8 million estate, studying the designer furniture and perfect artwork, trying to reconcile the spotless mansion with the idea that a desperate, suicidal pregnant woman had lived here. Everything about the place screamed control: the minimalist decor, the security cameras in every corner, the nursery with its hand-painted murals and $1,000 crib. This wasn't the home of someone spiraling into postpartum psychosis. This was a museum, or a prison. Matthews was 45, 20 years into a career that had shown her the worst of humanity. She'd worked homicides, domestic violence cases, cold cases that haunted her dreams. Her own sister had been murdered 15 years ago, case still unsolved. She knew how perpetrators lied, how they performed grief, how they fooled entire communities. And Derek Brennan's grief felt like a performance. "Detective Matthews?" Derek appeared in the doorway of the nursery. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, hair uncombed, the perfect image of a man falling apart. "Have you found anything new?" "Just doing a follow-up," Shoke Matthews said, "going over the timeline again." Derek nodded, leaning against the doorframe. "Of course. Whatever helps find Madison." Matthews consulted her notes. "Your wife left the house at approximately 11 p.m. the night she disappeared. Security footage shows her driving away alone. You were at a board meeting until midnight." "That's correct." "And you have multiple witnesses confirming you were at Gene Lux headquarters the entire time." "Yes, 8 board members, my assistant, building security." Derek's voice was steady. "I've given the FBI all their contact information." Too steady, Matthews thought. Too prepared. She moved around the nursery, examining details. The name Hope in pink letters, baby clothes still in packages, a rocking chair positioned by the window, and behind the changing table, barely visible, a small wireless camera. Matthews' pulse quickened. "Mr. Brennan, are there security cameras in the nursery?" "No," Derek said immediately. "Madison didn't want cameras in here. Said the baby should have privacy." Matthews pulled out her phone, casually photographing the room. The camera's lens caught the light for just a second. "I see. Well, I think I have everything I need for now." Derek walked her to the door. On the porch, he turned to her with red-rimmed eyes. "Please, detective, find my wife. Find my daughter. I can't lose them." "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Brennan." Matthews watched him close the door, watched him through the window as he walked back inside, watched the way his shoulders straightened the moment he thought no one could see him. Then she got in her car and drove straight to the precinct. 2 hours later, she sat in an evidence room with the camera's SD card. Her hands shook slightly as she inserted it into her computer. The card contained dozens of files, videos labeled by date, audio recordings, written notes. The most recent file was labeled, "Open only if I am gone." Matthews clicked it. Madison Brennan's face filled the screen. She looked exhausted, pale, 8 months pregnant, but her eyes were sharp and clear. "If you're watching this, I'm already gone," Madison said. Her voice was steady despite the fear visible in her expression. "Don't believe anything Derek says. Don't believe the therapy records he'll produce or the suicide notes he'll conveniently find. Everything you need is in the cloud. Password, Vance2019. Start with Gene Lux's server logs." Madison leaned closer to the camera. And detective, whoever you are, he's going to smile at the cameras. Watch for that smile. It means he thinks he got away with it. Contact FBI agent Rachel Foster. She'll explain everything. The video ended. Matthews sat in silence for a long moment. Then she rewound the video and watched Derek's press conference on her phone. Watched him cry. Watched him plead. Watched him smile. That half-second smile that didn't match the grief. She pulled up the FBI directory and searched for Rachel Foster. Found her in the white-collar crimes division. Matthews made the call. Agent Foster, this is Detective Sarah Matthews with Metro Homicide. I need to talk to you about Madison Brennan. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Foster's voice, careful and controlled. Meet me at the federal building. 1 hour. Come alone and don't tell anyone where you're going. Why the secrecy? Because Madison Brennan isn't dead, detective. She's in protective custody. And if Derek finds out, we lose our only chance to bring him down. The federal building's basement conference room smelled like recycled air and instant coffee. Matthews sat across from FBI Special Agent Rachel Foster, her mind racing as Foster laid out classified documents across the table. Madison Brennan contacted me 8 months ago, Foster said. She was composed, professional, but Matthews could see the tension in her shoulders. She'd discovered evidence of massive corporate fraud at Gene Lux Pharmaceuticals, securities violations, falsified clinical trial data, bribery. We're talking about a case that could bring down one of the largest biotech companies in the country. Matthews stared at the documents, FDA correspondence, financial records, internal emails. And her husband? Derek Brennan is at the center of all of it. He's not just the CEO, he's the architect. Madison found proof that 47 people died in Gene Lux's Alzheimer's drug trials. Deaths that were covered up, data that was manipulated, side effects that were hidden from regulators. That drug is worth $4 billion. Derek wasn't going to let anything threaten it, including his wife, especially his wife. Foster pulled up an audio file on her laptop. This was recorded 3 weeks before Madison disappeared. She'd been wearing a wire for us for months. She pressed play. Derek's voice filled the room, clear and cold. Madison's becoming a problem. She's asking too many questions about Vance. If she goes public before the IPO, we lose everything. I need her gone. Permanently. A woman's voice responded. Matthews recognized it from news coverage. Elena Morrison, Gene Lux's head of PR. What are you suggesting? Make it look like postpartum depression. Pregnant women have emotional problems all the time. No one will question it. Matthews felt sick. He was planning to murder her. Yes, so we moved fast. We staged her disappearance before he could act. The car by the bridge, the purse in the water, all of it coordinated with Madison. She's been in a safe house for 4 days while we build the case. She's alive. Matthews couldn't quite process it. She's actually alive. Very much so, and very pregnant. She's due in 3 weeks. Foster pulled up another document. But we need more than recordings. We need Derek to incriminate himself publicly. We need him to get confident, make mistakes, show his hand. That's where you come in. Me? Continue investigating as if this is a standard missing person case turning into a suspected homicide. Apply pressure, ask uncomfortable questions. Make Derek think you're getting close. He'll get desperate, reach out to his accomplices, maybe even try to cover his tracks. Everything he does gives us more evidence. Matthews thought about her sister, about the case that had never been solved, the killer who'd never been caught, about how many women vanished because powerful men thought they could get away with anything. What do you need me to do? Foster smiled grimly. First, let me show you what Madison found. For the next 2 hours, Foster walked Matthews through 18 months of evidence. Madison had been meticulous. As Gene Lux's former chief communications officer, she'd had access to internal systems. When she'd married Derek and stepped back from the company, she'd retained certain login credentials, enough to see what was really happening behind the billion-dollar facade. She'd discovered the deaths first, patients in clinical trials experiencing catastrophic side effects, strokes, heart attacks, organ failure, all of it buried in deleted files, unreported to the FDA, scrubbed from official records. Then she'd found Marcus Vance's emails. Vance was Derek's co-founder, Foster explained. Good guy, actually believed in ethical science. When he discovered the fraud 3 years ago, he threatened to go to the SEC. 2 weeks later, he supposedly committed suicide. Jumped from his 10th floor apartment. No note, no signs of depression. Case closed as suicide within 48 hours. Derek had him killed. Madison found proof, security footage from Vance's building showing Derek visiting the night Vance died. A payment of $50,000 to a man with connections to organized crime. Text messages between Derek and his lawyer discussing making the problem disappear. Foster's jaw tightened. Derek's been getting away with murder for years. Madison was just his next target. Matthews absorbed this. The dead man's switch Madison mentioned in her video. What is it? Automated system. If Madison doesn't check in every 7 days, everything she documented gets released automatically. Email dumps to every major news outlet, regulatory agencies, the FBI, even individual journalists. Thousands of files. Derek's entire empire exposed in one massive data leak. How long until it triggers? 3 more days. Matthews thought about Derek's press conference and his tearful interviews, his perfect performance. He thought he'd won. Thought Madison was dead or would never be found. Thought he could ride the sympathy wave straight to a $5 billion IPO. He had no idea the trap was already sprung. There's one more thing, Foster said quietly. Madison isn't doing this for revenge. She's doing it because she believes if we don't stop Derek, more people will die. That drug he's pushing through FDA approval, it doesn't work. At best, it's useless. At worst, it's killing people. And Derek knows it. Matthews looked at the evidence spread across the table, at the faces of patients who'd died, at the families who'd been lied to, at the emails where Derek casually discussed covering up deaths like they were inconvenient quarterly reports. This wasn't just about one woman escaping a dangerous husband. This was about stopping a killer who'd learned that with enough money and charm, you could literally get away with murder. When can I meet her? Matthews asked. Madison. Foster checked her watch. Tomorrow, but detective, when you see her, remember, she's 8 months pregnant, she's been in hiding for days, and she's terrified. The only thing keeping her going is knowing that her daughter will grow up in a world where Derek can't hurt anyone else. Matthews nodded. She thought about her sister again, about justice delayed and justice denied. Tell Madison I'll do everything I can to help. She knows, Foster said. She saw you on the news. She specifically asked for you to be brought in. Said she could tell you we're the kind of detective who doesn't give up. That night, Matthews couldn't sleep. She lay in bed thinking about everything Foster had shown her. Thinking about Derek's smile on camera. Thinking about Madison, hidden away, carrying a child, building a trap that would destroy a monster. And thinking about what would happen in 3 days when the switch triggered and Derek Brennan's world exploded. Detective Matthews met Madison Brennan in the safe house the next morning. The place was sterile and small, nothing like the mansion Madison had left behind. FBI agents monitored equipment in the corner while Foster made introductions. Madison sat on the couch, one hand resting on her pregnant belly. She looked tired but determined. When she shook Matthews' hand, her grip was firm. Thank you for coming, Madison said, and for not immediately thinking I was crazy when you found that camera. Matthews sat down across from her. Tell me everything, from the beginning. Madison took a breath. I married Derek 5 years ago. He was charming, successful, passionate about his work. I was chief communications officer at Gene Lux, so we worked together every day. Everyone said we were the perfect power couple. When did things change? Gradually. First it was small things. He wanted to know where I was all the time, who I talked to, what I said. He'd check my phone, my email, said it was because he cared, because he worried. Madison's voice remained steady, but Matthews saw the pain in her eyes. Then it was bigger things. He wanted me to quit working, said a CEO's wife shouldn't have her own career, made it sound like he was protecting me from stress. But it was about control. Everything with Derek is about control. Madison shifted, adjusting her position. At 8 months pregnant, sitting was uncomfortable. I quit because I was pregnant and thought maybe he was right. Maybe I could step back, focus on becoming a mother. But the moment I left Gene Lux officially, everything got worse. How? He monitored everything, where I went, who I saw. He installed cameras throughout the house, said it was for security, but I knew he was watching me. My therapist, my doctor, my friends, they all started saying things that sounded like Derek's words. I realized he'd been talking to them, shaping their perception of me. Foster interjected. Derek was building a narrative as threatened, establishing that Madison was mentally unstable, that pregnancy had made her paranoid and irrational. Classic abuser tactic. Madison nodded. I started to feel like I was going crazy. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe the pregnancy hormones were affecting me. Then one night, 6 months ago, and I couldn't sleep. Derek was working late. I went into his home office and found his laptop unlocked. What did you find? Emails about Marcus Vance, Derek's co-founder who supposedly committed suicide 3 years ago. Except these emails made it clear it wasn't suicide. Derek had him killed because Vance was going to expose the fraud. Madison's voice hardened. I spent that whole night going through files. I found everything. The falsified data, the covered-up deaths, the bribes, and I found plans for the IPO. Derek was about to take Gene Lux public, sell his shares for billions, and leave thousands of people holding stock in a company built on lies. Matthews leaned forward. That's when you decided to expose him. That's when I decided to survive. Madison met her eyes. Because in those emails, I also found messages to Elena Morrison about me, about how I was becoming a liability, about how problems needed to be eliminated before the IPO. Derek was going to kill me, detective. The only question was when. The room fell silent except for the hum of FBI equipment. I contacted Agent Foster, Madison continued, started wearing a wire, documented everything I could access. But I knew documentation wouldn't be enough. Derek has the best lawyers money can buy. He'd fight any charges for years. I needed him to incriminate himself so thoroughly that even his lawyers couldn't save him. So you planned to disappear. I planned to make him think I was dead, because that's when he'd get confident. That's when he'd make mistakes. That's when everyone would see what I'd been seeing for months. Madison's hand moved to her belly again, a protective gesture. I set up the dead man's switch 3 months ago. Encrypted cloud drives, automated email systems. If I didn't check in every 7 days, everything would be released automatically. Then I told Agent Foster I was ready. Foster picked up the story. We staged the disappearance carefully. Madison drove to the bridge herself, abandoned the car, threw her purse and phone into the water. We had agents positioned to make sure she was safe. She walked to a predetermined location, and we brought her here. And Derek believed it, Matthews said. Of course he did. Madison's smile was bitter, because he was planning to kill him anyway. The only thing that surprised him was that I did it first. He probably thinks I panicked, ran away, maybe actually jumped. Either way, he thinks the problem is solved. Matthews studied Madison's face. 7 years of marriage to a man who'd planned to murder her. 8 months of pretending everything was fine while documenting his crimes. The courage it must have taken to disappear while 8 months pregnant, to hide in a safe house, to trust that the plan would work. What happens when the dead man's switch triggers? Matthews asked. Madison's expression hardened. Derek's world ends. Every news outlet, every regulatory agency, every journalist who's ever covered Gene Lux gets 18 months of evidence. Email dumps, audio recordings, financial records, proof of 47 deaths, proof of fraud, and proof that Derek Brennan planned to murder his pregnant wife. He'll be arrested. He'll be destroyed. Madison locked eyes with Matthews. His reputation, his company, his freedom, everything he valued more than human life will be taken from him. And he'll spend the rest of his life in prison knowing that I beat him. There was no triumph in her voice, no satisfaction, just exhausted determination. How are you holding up? Matthews asked quietly. Madison was silent for a moment. I'm terrified. Every day I wake up thinking maybe Derek figured it out. Maybe he knows I'm alive. Maybe he'll find me before the switch triggers. I have nightmares about him finding this safe house, about hope being born while I'm running, about failing at the very end. But you keep going. I keep going because 47 people made sure and their families deserve justice because Derek killed Marcus Vance and got away with it. Because if I don't stop him, the next woman he marries might not be as lucky as me. Madison's voice grew stronger. And because my daughter deserves to grow up in a world where men like Derek don't win. Matthews nodded slowly. In her 20 years as a detective, she'd seen victims who stayed silent out of fear. She'd seen victims who fought back and lost. She'd seen her own sister become a statistic, a cold case file, a name without justice. But she'd never seen anything like Madison Brennan, a woman who'd turned herself into bait, who'd disappeared to expose a monster, who'd built a trap so perfect that even if Derek killed her, he'd still lose everything. 2 more days, Foster said. Then the switch triggers and we move in. Madison touched her belly. Hope is due in 3 weeks. I just need to stay hidden for 2 more days. Then she can be born free. 2 days felt like an eternity. Madison moved through the safe house like a ghost, monitoring news coverage, checking her automated systems, counting down hours. FBI agents rotated in 8-hour shifts. Foster visited twice daily. Matthew stopped by every evening to update her on Derek's activities. And Derek performed beautifully. On national television, he announced the Madison Brennan Memorial Fund, $1 million dedicated to maternal mental health research. The cameras loved him. America loved him. His approval ratings soared. Behind closed doors, Matthews was applying pressure. She showed up at Gene Luck's headquarters with a warrant for financial records, questioned board members about the night Madison disappeared, asked Derek's assistant about security footage from his office, made it obvious that the investigation was closing in. Derek's lawyers pushed back, of course, filed motions, threatened lawsuits, called the police commissioner to complain about harassment. But Matthews could see the cracks forming. Derek's smile became tighter. His interviews more defensive. He was getting nervous. Good. On the evening of day 6, Matthews sat in her car outside Gene Lux's building, watching Derek through the windows. He was in his office, pacing, phone pressed to his ear. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders. Her own phone rang. Foster. He just called Elena Morrison, Foster said without preamble. FBI had warrants for wiretaps on everyone in Derek's inner circle. He's spiraling. Says you're getting too close, that they need to clean up any remaining evidence. Is Elena cooperating? She's terrified. We offered her immunity 2 days ago and she took it. She's recording everything. Foster paused. Derek just told her to delete server files, destroy backup drives, get rid of anything linking him to the clinical trial deaths. Obstruction of justice. Add it to the list. Foster's voice held grim satisfaction. 12 hours until the switch triggers. Derek's about to have the worst day of his life. That night, Madison couldn't sleep. She sat in the safe house living room, watching Derek's interview with CNN from earlier that day. He looked exhausted, desperate beneath the carefully maintained facade. Madison was the love of my life, he told the reporter. I'd give anything to have her back. Anything. Except the truth, Madison thought. Except admitting what you did. Except facing consequences. Hope kicked against her ribs. Madison pressed a hand to her belly, feeling her daughter move. 3 weeks until her due date. 3 weeks until she could hold hope, could finally breathe, could start building a life away from Derek's shadow. Almost there, baby girl, she whispered. Almost safe. At 3 a.m., Matthews got a call from Foster. Elena just sent us something big. Derek called her an hour ago, drunk and angry. She recorded the whole conversation. He admitted everything. Said Madison probably ran away because she'd figured out what he was planning. Said he should have killed her sooner, should have done it himself instead of making it look like suicide. Matthews sat up in bed. That's a confession. That's a confession. Combined with everything else Madison documented, we have him. The question is whether we wait for the dead man's switch to trigger or move in early. What does Madison want? She wants the world to see what kind of man Derek Brennan really is. Not just law enforcement, not just a trial. Everyone. Every person who watched him cry on television, who donated to his memorial fund, who thought he was a grieving husband. She wants them to know the truth. Matthews understood. Justice wasn't just about Derek going to prison. It was about exposing him. stripping away the mask, making sure his crimes were public record forever. Then we wait until morning, Matthews said. Let the switch trigger exactly as Madison planned. 6 a.m. Madison sat at the FBI agent's computer, her finger hovering over the keyboard. All she had to do was not enter her password, not reset the 7-day clock. Let the automated system execute exactly as she'd programmed it 3 months ago. Foster stood beside her. Matthews had arrived an hour earlier. Other agents monitored news feeds, ready to track the leak's impact in real time. Last chance to back out, Foster said quietly. We have enough evidence to arrest him now. You don't have to do this. Madison thought about Marcus Vance, pushed from a window, about the 47 patients who'd died trusting Gene Lux, about all the women who'd seen their partners smile on camera while planning their murders. I'm doing this, Madison said. She stood up, walked away from the computer, let the clock run out. At 6:15 a.m., the dead man's switch triggered. 18 months of evidence began flooding across the internet. The Washington Post received 60,000 pages of internal documents. The New York Times got audio recordings. CNN received video depositions. The SEC got financial records. The FBI's Public Corruption Division got everything. And individual journalists, the ones who'd interviewed Derek, who'd written sympathetic profiles, who'd called him America's biotech visionary, got personalized packages of evidence showing exactly who Derek Brennan really was. By 6:30, the first headlines appeared online. Gene Lux Pharmaceuticals CEO implicated in massive fraud. Dozens dead in covered-up clinical trials. Madison Brennan left evidence trail before disappearance. By 7 a.m., cable news was wall-to-wall coverage. Financial networks watched Gene Lux's stock price plummet. Trading was halted within minutes. The board of directors issued an emergency statement. By 8 a.m., Derek's lawyers were calling every news outlet, threatening lawsuits, claiming the evidence was fabricated. But it was too late. The world was listening to Derek's voice on recordings, casually discussing covering up deaths, reading his emails about eliminating problems, watching footage of him at Vance's apartment the night his co-founder died. And everyone remembered his perfect, tearful press conferences, his wounded husband act, his smile, that smile that meant he thought he'd gotten away with murder. Matthews watched the news coverage from the safe house. Beside her, Madison sat very still, one hand on her belly, tears running silently down her face. Not tears of sadness, tears of relief. It's working, Foster said, phone pressed to her ear. FBI field office just got orders to raid Gene Lux headquarters. They were moving in now. On television, aerial footage showed federal agents swarming the building. Employees evacuated with hands up, boxes of evidence carried out, and Derek Brennan, in handcuffs, being led to a waiting vehicle. His face was white with shock. His carefully maintained composure shattered. He looked into the cameras, and for the first time, everyone saw the real Derek. Angry, desperate, caught. He's done, Matthews said. Madison nodded, unable to speak. The trap had worked exactly as planned. Derek Brennan's arrest was broadcast live across every major network. Cameras captured the moment FBI agents surrounded him in Gene Lux's lobby, the moment they read his rights, the moment his face transformed from confusion to rage. This is a setup, he shouted at the cameras, fighting against the handcuffs. Madison did this. She's probably not even dead. This is all lies. Special Agent Foster stepped into frame, badge displayed prominently. Derek Brennan, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, securities fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and 47 counts of involuntary manslaughter related to deaths in Gene Lux Pharmaceuticals clinical trials. You can't prove I killed her. There's no body. Foster allowed herself a small smile. That's because she's not dead, Mr. Brennan. The color drained from Derek's face. The cameras caught every second of his realization. Every news outlet would replay that moment for weeks. The instant Derek understood he'd been trapped. In the safe house, Madison watched the footage with her hand pressed to her chest. She'd spent 8 months terrified that Derek would find her, kill her, make her disappear for real. 8 months carrying hope, documenting evidence, building the trap while pretending everything was fine. And now he knew. Derek finally understood that Madison had beaten him. "How are you feeling?" Matthews asked quietly. Madison couldn't articulate the complex emotions surging through her. Relief, vindication, grief for the woman she'd been before she'd learned the truth about her husband, fear for the trial ahead, joy that Hope would never know Derek as anything but a prisoner. "I'm feeling like I can breathe," she finally said. The news coverage continued. Reporters dug into the leaked evidence, each discovery more damning than the last. Audio of Derek telling Elena Morrison to make it look like postpartum depression. Emails discussing paying off FDA officials. Financial records showing how Derek had structured shell companies to hide assets. And the clinical trial data. 47 patients who died while taking Gene Lux's Alzheimer's drug. Families who'd been told their loved ones died of natural causes or unrelated complications. All of it buried, deleted, covered up so Derek could take his company public and become a billionaire. By noon, Gene Lux's board of directors held an emergency press conference. They announced Derek's immediate termination, the company's cooperation with all investigations, and the establishment of a $2.3 billion victim compensation fund using Derek's seized assets. By afternoon, Elena Morrison appeared on national television with her lawyer. She'd been granted immunity in exchange for testimony. She looked pale, shaking, but determined. "I want to apologize to Madison Brennan," Elena said, tears streaming down her face, "and to my sister Emily, who died in Gene Lux's Phase 3 trials. Derek told me it was an unrelated stroke. He lied. He killed my sister and 46 other people, and I stayed silent because I was afraid and ambitious and weak." The reporter leaned forward. "You recorded conversations with Derek Brennan?" "For 6 months. Madison reached out to me 8 months ago. She showed me the evidence about Emily, asked me to help her stop Derek before he killed more people." Elena's voice broke. "I almost said no. I almost chose my career over justice. But Madison said something that changed my mind. She said, 'Your sister deserved to live. So does my daughter.'" In the safe house, Madison felt hope kick against her palm. 3 weeks until her due date. 3 weeks until she could hold her daughter and tell her the story of how they survived. "Elena's testimony will be crucial," Foster said. She was coordinating with the prosecution team, preparing for the trial that would dominate headlines for months. "Between her recordings and your documentation, we have Derek on multiple counts. He's looking at life in prison." "What about the murder conspiracy charge?" Matthews asked. "He never actually killed Madison." "Conspiracy to commit murder doesn't require a completed crime. We have him on recording planning Madison's death. We have evidence he was taking steps to make it happen." "That's enough." Foster glanced at Madison. "But the strongest case is the corporate fraud. 47 counts of involuntary manslaughter, securities fraud, bribery. That's where we'll bury him." Madison nodded. She didn't need Derek convicted of trying to kill her specifically. She needed him convicted of being a killer. Period. That evening, Madison felt the first contraction. It was mild, just a tightening across her belly. She was only 8 months pregnant, still 3 weeks from her due date. Probably Braxton Hicks. Practice contractions. Nothing to worry about. But 30 minutes later, another one came. Stronger this time. "Agent Foster?" Madison's voice was tight. "I think you should call the doctor." Foster was on the phone immediately. The FBI had arranged for Madison to deliver at a secure facility, a military hospital where her identity could be protected. But that was supposed to happen in 3 weeks. The third contraction hit harder. Madison gasped, gripping the couch. "She's in labor," Foster told someone on the phone. "Yes, early. Get the medical team ready." Matthews grabbed Madison's hand. "Breathe, just breathe. We're going to get you to the hospital." "It's too early," Madison said through gritted teeth. "Hope isn't supposed to come yet. Derek just got arrested. I haven't testified. Nothing's finished." "Hope doesn't care about the timeline," Foster said, helping Madison to her feet. "Babies come when they're ready." 20 minutes later, Madison was in a secure ambulance. FBI agents surrounding the vehicle, racing toward the military hospital. The contractions were coming every 10 minutes now. Regular, intense, real labor. Matthews rode with her, holding her hand, talking her through each contraction. "This isn't how it was supposed to happen," Madison said, breathing hard. "I was supposed to testify first. Make sure Derek was convicted. Make sure Hope was safe before she was born." "She is safe," Matthews said firmly. "Derek's in federal custody. He can't hurt you. He can't hurt Hope. You did it, Madison. You beat him." Another contraction. Madison cried out, squeezing Matthews' hands so hard her knuckles turned white. "Women are strong in ways men can't imagine," Matthews said quietly. "You outsmarted a billionaire. You built a trap that brought down a killer. You did all of that while pregnant, while terrified, while hiding, and now you're about to bring your daughter into a world where Derek Brennan can't touch her." Madison looked at her through tears. "Will you stay? For the birth?" "I'm not going anywhere." They arrived at the military hospital as the sun set. Madison was wheeled into a secure delivery room, FBI agents posted outside, Foster coordinating with hospital security. 12 hours of labor. Through the pain, through the exhaustion, Madison thought about everything that had led to this moment. Meeting Derek, marrying him, discovering what he really was, building the evidence trail, planning her disappearance, triggering the dead man's switch, all of it to reach this point, to bring Hope into the world safely. At 3:17 a.m., Madison Claire Brennan gave birth to a healthy baby girl, 7 pounds, 6 ounces. Perfect. Hope Marie Brennan. Foster and Matthew stood in the room, both of them crying as Madison held her daughter for the first time. "She's beautiful," Foster whispered. Madison couldn't speak. She looked at Hope's tiny face, her perfect fingers, her daughter's eyes blinking open for the first time. This was what she'd been fighting for. Not revenge, not victory over Derek. This life, this tiny, perfect life that deserved to grow up safe. 200 miles away, Derek Brennan sat in a federal holding cell. He'd been denied bail, deemed a flight risk and a danger to witnesses. His lawyers were working frantically, but the evidence was overwhelming. He didn't know yet that he had a daughter. He didn't know that Madison had given birth the same night he was arrested. He would find out during the trial, would learn that while he sat in a cell, his daughter was in the world, being held by the woman he tried to destroy. But Hope would never know Derek as anything but a prisoner, would never hear his voice except in evidence recordings, would never feel his presence in her life. Madison held her daughter close and felt something she hadn't felt in 8 months. Peace. 6 months later, the trial of Derek Brennan began at the federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan. Security was unprecedented. Media circus outside. Inside, the courtroom was packed with victims' families, reporters, and spectators who'd followed the case obsessively since Madison's disappearance. Madison sat in the prosecution section, Hope in her arms. The judge had granted an unusual exception, allowing Madison to hold her 6-month-old daughter while testifying. The prosecution had argued that separating them would cause undue emotional distress, and that Hope's presence would help the jury understand exactly what Derek had been willing to destroy. Derek sat at the defense table in a suit that cost more than most people's cars. He'd lost weight during his 6 months in custody. His hair had grayed at the temples, but his expression remained cold, calculating. Even now, even facing life in prison, he believed he could win. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a man who believed he was above the law, a man who killed 47 people to protect his profits, a man who murdered his business partner to maintain control, a man who planned to murder his pregnant wife because she discovered the truth." The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Jennifer Walsh, walked the jury through the evidence. The falsified clinical trial data, the covered-up deaths, the bribes to FDA officials, the audio recordings of Derek casually discussing killing Madison. You'll hear Derek Brennan's voice on these recordings. Not a stranger's testimony about what he said, his actual voice, discussing how to make his wife's death look like suicide, planning the timeline, choosing the method. Walsh paused. "And you'll meet Madison Brennan, who was brave enough to document these crimes, intelligent enough to build a trap her husband couldn't escape, and strong enough to disappear to save her own life and expose him." Derek's defense attorney, a high-priced lawyer named Robert Harrison, tried to argue that Madison had fabricated evidence, that she was mentally unstable, that this was an elaborate revenge plot by a bitter wife. But the evidence spoke for itself. The trial lasted 4 weeks. Each day brought new revelations. Week 1 focused on the clinical trial deaths. Families testified about losing loved ones. Medical experts explained how Gene Lux's drug had caused strokes, heart attacks, organ failure. FBI forensic accountants showed how Derek had structured shell companies to hide the payoffs to silence families. One woman, Sarah Miller, testified about her mother's death during the trials. My mother had early onset Alzheimer's. She was only 56. When Gene Lux offered a spot in their Phase 3 trial, we thought it was a miracle. 3 months later, she had a massive stroke, died within hours. Derek Brennan himself came to the funeral, held my hand, said my mother's death was tragic but unrelated to the medication. Sarah's voice broke. He lied to my face while my mother was in a casket, and then his company paid us $50,000 to sign an NDA. 47 families told similar stories. The jury listened, many openly crying. Week 2 covered Marcus Vance's death. Madison's evidence showed Derek had been at Vance's apartment the night he died. Security footage showed Derek arriving at 10 p.m., leaving at 11:30. Vance's body was discovered the next morning. Financial records revealed Derek paid $50,000 to a known criminal 2 days before Vance's death. Phone records showed multiple calls between Derek and this man in the weeks leading up to the supposed suicide. The detective who'd originally investigated Vance's death took the stand looking ashamed. I closed it as suicide because there was no evidence of forced entry, no signs of struggle. Derek Brennan was Vance's business partner and best friend. He seemed devastated. I didn't look deeper. He paused. I should have. Week 3 focused on Derek's plan to kill Madison. Elena Morrison testified for 3 days. She'd been Derek's mistress, his confidant, his accomplice. Now she was the prosecution's star witness. Derek told me Madison had become a liability, Elena said, her voice steady despite visible fear. He said she was asking too many questions about Vance, digging into files she shouldn't access. He was worried she'd go public before the IPA. Walsh played the recordings. Derek's voice filled the courtroom. Make it look like postpartum depression. Pregnant women have emotional problems all the time. No one will question it. The jury heard Derek discussing the best way to kill his pregnant wife, the optimal timing, how to manipulate Madison's therapist into providing documentation of mental instability, how to stage the scene to look like suicide. And they heard the recording from the night before Madison disappeared. Derek calling Elena while drunk. Should have done it myself, should have just pushed her down the stairs, made it look like an accident. Women fall all the time when they're pregnant. At the defense table, Derek showed no emotion. But Madison, watching from across the courtroom while nursing Hope, saw the tiny muscle working in his jaw, saw his hands clenched beneath the table. He was losing and he knew it. Week 4 was Madison's turn to testify. The courtroom fell silent as Madison approached the witness stand. She carried 6-month-old Hope in her arms, the baby dressed in a pink dress, sleeping peacefully. Madison wore a simple blue suit, her hair pulled back, no jewelry except her wedding ring. She'd kept Derek's ring, not out of sentiment, but as evidence, proof that she'd been his wife, that she'd trusted him, that the betrayal was complete. Prosecutor Walsh approached with a gentle smile. Mrs. Brennan, thank you for being here. I know this is difficult. I'm ready, Madison said. Her voice was clear, strong. Can you tell the jury about your relationship with Derek Brennan? Madison shifted Hope in her arms, the baby stirring slightly. I met Derek 7 years ago. I was Chief Communications Officer at Gene Lux Pharmaceuticals. He was the CEO, brilliant and charismatic. Everyone at the company admired him. I thought he was building something important, something that would help people. When did you start to see another side of him? Gradually, after we married, he became more controlling. Wanted to know where I was constantly, checked my phone, my emails. When I got pregnant, he insisted I quit working, said it was too stressful for the baby. Madison's voice remained steady. I thought he was being protective. I didn't realize he was isolating me. Walsh walked her through the timeline, the discovery of the clinical trial deaths, the emails about Marcus Vance, the moment Madison had realized Derek was planning to kill her. What did you do when you discovered evidence of the cover-up? I contacted the FBI, Special Agent Rachel Foster. I started documenting everything I could access, wearing a wire during conversations with Derek, copying files, building evidence. Why didn't you just leave? Go to the police immediately? Madison looked at the jury. Because I knew Derek would fight any charges. He has the best lawyers, unlimited resources. I needed evidence so overwhelming that even his money couldn't save him. And I needed him to incriminate himself so thoroughly that the whole world would see what kind of man he really was. So you planned to disappear. I planned to make Derek think I was dead, because that's when he'd get confident, make mistakes, show his true nature. Madison's hand moved protectively over Hope. I was 8 months pregnant. I was terrified. But I knew if I didn't do something, Derek would kill me and claim it was postpartum depression. And then he'd continue killing patients with drugs that don't work, bribing officials, destroying anyone who threatened his empire. Walsh played the recordings for the jury, Derek's voice, cold and calculating, discussing Madison's murder. The jury watched Madison's face as she listened to her husband planning to kill her. She didn't cry. She'd cried enough during the 6 months since Hope's birth. Now she just needed to tell the truth. Mrs. Brennan, you set up what's called a dead man's switch. Can you explain what that was? An automated system. If I didn't log in and enter my password every 7 days, everything I documented would be released automatically. Thousands of files sent to news outlets, regulatory agencies, journalists. I set it up 3 months before I disappeared, when I realized Derek was escalating. And on the morning of your disappearance, you drove to Riverside Bridge and abandoned your car. Why that location? Derek had mentioned it once, months earlier, said it would be a good place for someone to commit suicide. Isolated, water below, no cameras. I realized he was already planning the scene, so I used his own plan against him. The defense attorney objected multiple times, arguing that Madison had obstructed justice, filed false police reports, wasted law enforcement resources. But Judge Richardson overruled each objection. Madison's actions had been coordinated with the FBI as part of a legitimate investigation. Walsh's final question was simple. Mrs. Brennan, do you believe Derek would have killed you if you hadn't disappeared? Madison looked across the courtroom at Derek. He stared back, his face expressionless. For 7 years, she'd loved that face, trusted it, built a life with it. Now she knew every expression was calculated, every emotion performed. Yes, she said clearly. I believe Derek would have killed me and made it look like suicide. I believe he would have raised Hope alone, playing the grieving widower, using our daughter for sympathy. And I believe he would have never faced consequences for any of his crimes. She shifted Hope in her arms. The baby woke, blinking up at Madison with blue eyes that looked nothing like Derek's. But I refused to be a victim. I refused to let him win. And I refused to let my daughter grow up thinking her mother was too weak to fight back. The courtroom was silent. Then Derek's lawyer, Harrison, stood for cross-examination. He was aggressive, trying to paint Madison as vindictive, calculating, mentally unstable. Isn't it true, Mrs. Brennan, that you faked your own death? A felony. I coordinated with the FBI as part of their investigation. Isn't it true you manipulated evidence, tampered with company files? I documented crimes I witnessed as an employee and spouse. Isn't it true you wanted revenge on your husband for his affair with Ms. Morrison? Madison paused, took a breath. I didn't care about the affair. I cared that Derek was killing people and planned to kill me. Harrison pressed harder. You expect this jury to believe you're a hero? You lied to police, you faked evidence, you orchestrated an elaborate scheme. I survived, Madison interrupted, her voice cutting through his questions. I survived a man who murdered 47 people and was planning to make me number 48. If that makes me a criminal in your eyes, I'll accept that judgment. But your client planned to kill me and my daughter. Everything I did was to stop him. Harrison tried to continue, but the damage was done. The jury had seen Madison hold her sleeping baby while describing how her husband planned her murder. They'd heard Derek's voice on recordings, cold and businesslike, as he discussed making his pregnant wife disappear. No amount of legal maneuvering could overcome that. Madison stepped down from the witness stand. As she walked past Derek's table, she stopped for just a moment. Their eyes met. Derek's expression cracked. For the first time since his arrest, real emotion showed on his face. Rage, hatred, the mask finally falling away. "You destroyed everything," he hissed. Madison shifted hope in her arms. "No, Derek, you destroyed everything. I just made sure everyone knew." She walked back to the prosecution's section. Detective Matthews squeezed her shoulder. Agent Foster nodded approval. Hope yawned, completely oblivious to the fact that her mother had just testified against her father in the most high-profile criminal trial of the decade. The trial continued for 2 more days. Closing arguments, jury instructions, deliberations. Madison waited in a secure room with Foster and Matthews while the jury decided Derek's fate. 6 hours of waiting. 6 hours of holding hope, feeding her, changing her, trying not to think about what would happen if the jury found Derek not guilty. At 4:30 p.m., the clerk announced the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled. Madison returned to her seat, hope sleeping against her chest. Derek stood as the jury foreman rose. In the case of United States versus Derek Brennan, on the count of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. On 47 counts of involuntary manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty. On charges of securities fraud, we find the defendant guilty. Guilty on all counts, all. Derek's face went white. His lawyers moved to support him as his knees buckled. Madison felt tears streaming down her face. Not tears of joy, tears of exhausted relief. Hope was safe. The families of the 47 victims would have justice. Marcus Vance would have justice. And she would never have to be afraid of Derek again. 1 month later, the courtroom reconvened for sentencing. Derek had lost weight during the trial. His expensive suits hung loose on his frame. His lawyers had filed multiple motions for a new trial, all denied. Now they argued for leniency. Derek's contributions to biotech research, his philanthropy, his lack of prior criminal record. Judge Richardson listened impassively. Then the families of the victims were allowed to speak. 47 people had died in Gene Lux's clinical trials. Their children, spouses, parents, and siblings stood one by one to describe what Derek's crimes had cost them. "My father trusted your drug," one man said, staring at Derek. He was 72, suffering from Alzheimer's, desperate for anything that might help. 3 months into the trial, he had a massive stroke. "You told us it was unrelated. You paid us to stay quiet. You killed my father for profit." A woman in her 30s. "My wife was only 34, early onset Alzheimer's. She had 2 small children. Your drug killed her and you covered it up so your stock price wouldn't drop. My kids grew up without a mother because you chose money over human lives." Story after story, 47 lives ended. Hundreds of family members destroyed. Derek sat motionless through it all. Finally, it was Madison's turn to speak. She approached the podium with hope in her arms. 7 months old now, alert and curious, looking around the courtroom with wide blue eyes. "Your Honor," Madison began, "I don't want to talk about what Derek did to me. The jury has heard that story. Instead, I want to talk about hope." She shifted her daughter so the courtroom could see her face. "Hope will grow up knowing her father is in prison. She'll ask questions someday. Why did Daddy do bad things? Why can't we see him? Why did Mommy have to hide?" Madison's voice remained steady. "And I'll tell her the truth, that her father valued money more than human life, that he killed people and felt no remorse, that he planned to kill us both to protect his secrets." She looked at Derek directly. "But I'll also tell her that we survived, that we fought back, that we made sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. And I'll tell her that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to be destroyed by someone who wants to destroy you." Madison sat down. Judge Richardson reviewed the evidence, the testimony, the severity of the crimes. Then he rendered his sentence. "Derek Brennan, you have been convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, 47 counts of involuntary manslaughter, securities fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. These crimes represent a profound betrayal of trust. You were given every advantage in life: education, wealth, opportunity. You use those advantages to harm vulnerable people, to cover up deaths, to destroy anyone who threatened your empire. The judge paused. For the conspiracy to commit murder, 25 years. For the involuntary manslaughter charges, 47 consecutive life sentences. For securities fraud and related charges, an additional 30 years. Derek closed his eyes. You will serve life in federal prison without possibility of parole. Genelux Pharmaceuticals' remaining assets will be liquidated to establish a victim compensation fund. You are hereby ordered to pay $2.3 billion in restitution. The gavel came down. It was over. Derek was led away in handcuffs. He didn't look at Madison, didn't look at Hope, just stared straight ahead as guards escorted him from the courtroom for the last time. Outside, reporters swarmed. Matthews and Foster formed a protective barrier around Madison, while she made a brief statement. Today, justice was served for 47 people who trusted Genelux Pharmaceuticals and paid with their lives. Justice was served for Marcus Vance, who tried to expose the truth and was murdered for it. And justice was served for every woman who has ever been told she's crazy, paranoid, or emotionally unstable when she knew something was wrong. She held Hope close. I want to thank the FBI, particularly Special Agent Rachel Foster, for believing me and helping me survive. I want to thank Detective Sarah Matthews for never giving up on finding the truth. And I want to thank the jury for seeing through Derek's lies. A reporter called out, "What will you do now?" Madison paused. What would she do now? For 8 months, her entire existence had been focused on exposing Derek, staying alive, protecting Hope. Now Derek was in prison. Genelux was dissolved. The victims had compensation. The story was over. Except it wasn't. Now, Madison said slowly, I'm going to raise my daughter. I'm going to testify in the 14 additional cases being brought against Genelux executives. I'm going to work with lawmakers on the Brennan Act, which will require independent oversight of all clinical trials. And I'm going to make sure Hope grows up knowing that women don't have to accept being victimized. She looked into the cameras. If you're in a relationship where you feel controlled, monitored, isolated, trust that feeling. If someone tells you you're crazy when your gut says something is wrong, believe yourself, not them. And if you need to escape, plan carefully, document everything, and reach out for help. Madison turned away from the cameras. Foster and Matthews walked with her to a waiting car. Inside, finally away from the press, Madison let herself breathe. It's really over, she said. It's over, Foster confirmed. Derek will never get out. You're safe. Hope babbled, reaching for Madison's face with tiny hands. We're safe, Madison whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. Finally safe. The farmer's market was busy that Saturday morning. Madison pushed a stroller through the crowd, stopping occasionally to admire fresh produce or handmade crafts. Her hair was shorter now, lighter. No makeup, casual clothes, sunglasses hiding her eyes. 2 years since Derek's sentencing. 2 years of rebuilding her life. Hope was almost 2.5, walking now, chattering constantly in that delightful toddler way where words tumbled over each other. She pointed at everything, asking, what's that? And why? And can we? Flowers, Hope announced, pointing at a vendor's display. Those are peonies, Madison said, crouching down to Hope's level. Do you like them? Pretty. Madison bought a bouquet. Simple pleasure, picking out flowers on a Saturday morning with her daughter. No security cameras, no monitoring, no fear. She'd changed her name legally. Not Madison Brennan anymore, but Madison Hartford, her mother's maiden name. Hope's last name was changed too. They'd moved across the country to a small town where no one recognized Madison's face. Started over completely. The trial had been huge news, but America's attention span was short. After a few months, the headlines faded. Other scandals took center stage. Madison became a footnote, and she preferred it that way. She testified in 14 more cases against Genelux executives. 8 of them were now serving prison sentences. Elena Morrison had started a victim advocacy nonprofit. Madison served on the board. Detective Matthews had been promoted to captain and had finally closed her sister's cold case using techniques she'd learned during Madison's investigation. The Brennan Act had passed Congress 6 months ago. Pharmaceutical companies now faced mandatory third-party oversight of clinical trials. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. A federal domestic violence registry had been created to help protect pregnant women. 47 lives lost, but the reforms would save countless others. Madison didn't think about Derek often anymore. He was serving his life sentence at a maximum security federal prison. His appeals had all been denied. His assets were seized. His name was synonymous with corporate fraud and attempted murder. He'd written letters to Madison from prison. She burned them without reading them. He had no right to her attention, no right to her forgiveness, no right to even think about Hope. "Mama, look!" Hope had found a vendor selling toys. Madison followed her daughter, watching Hope's delight at simple wooden blocks and cloth dolls. This was what mattered. These ordinary moments, these Saturday mornings, this life they'd built from the ashes of Derek's destruction. A voice called out, "Mrs. Brennan?" Madison's heart stopped. She turned slowly. A reporter stood nearby with a camera crew, young, mid-20s, ambitious, the kind who'd do anything for a scoop. "I'm Madison Hartford," Madison said calmly. "Sorry, Mrs. Hartford. I recognized you from the trial coverage. Can I ask you a few questions about—" "No." Madison's voice was firm. She picked up Hope, held her close. "My daughter and I are private citizens. We're not interested in interviews. Just 5 minutes. The public wants to know how you're doing, if Derek has tried to contact you, if the public doesn't need to know anything about us." Madison met the reporter's eyes. "I survived a man who tried to kill me. I exposed crimes that needed exposing. I testified in court. I did my part. Now I'm raising my daughter in peace. That's all you need to know." She walked away, Hope on her hip, ignoring the reporter's continued questions. Her hands shook slightly as she buckled Hope into her car seat. 2 years later, in moments like this, could still trigger the fear. The sense that she was being watched, monitored, hunted. But then Hope patted her cheek. "Okay, Mama?" Madison took a breath. "I'm okay, baby." She drove home to their small house on a quiet street. Nothing like Derek's mansion. Just a modest 3-bedroom with a backyard where Hope could play. No security cameras except the doorbell key. No smart home systems. Nothing Derek could hack or monitor. That afternoon, while Hope napped, Madison worked on her laptop. She'd been writing a book about her experience. Not a revenge memoir, but a guide for women in similar situations. How to document abuse. How to plan an escape. How to protect yourself legally and physically. The book was almost finished. Her agent said publishers were interested. Madison wasn't doing it for money. All proceeds would go to domestic violence charities. She was doing it because somewhere another woman was married to a man like Derek. And maybe Madison's story could help her survive. Her phone rang. Detective Matthews, who'd become a close friend over the past 2 years. "Hey," Matthews said. "Just checking in. Saw on the news that a reporter ambushed you at the farmer's market. Word travels fast. Are you okay?" Madison looked at the baby monitor, watching Hope sleep peacefully. "I'm okay, just reminded me that I'll never be completely anonymous. The price of doing what I did." "The price of surviving," Matthews corrected. "You saved lives, Madison. The Brennan Act alone will prevent what happened to those 47 patients from happening to others. That matters." "I know." Madison did know, but sometimes she missed the idea of being truly invisible. "Derek's lawyers filed another appeal," Matthews said. "It'll be denied like all the others. But I wanted you to know. He'll never stop trying. He'll never get out. The evidence is too strong. The sentence is too severe. He's going to die in prison, Madison. You won." Had she won? Madison wasn't sure the word winning applied to a situation where 47 people had died, where she'd spent 8 months in fear, where Hope would grow up visiting her mother's therapist to process the trauma of what her father had done. But she'd survived. Hope was safe. Derek was in prison. That was something. That evening, after dinner and bath time and stories, Madison tucked Hope into bed. Her daughter's room was painted soft yellow, filled with books and toys and love. Nothing like the perfectly designed nursery in Derek's mansion. "Mama," Hope said sleepily, "story about you." They developed this ritual. Every night, Hope asked for a story, and Madison would tell her age-appropriate versions of tales about bravery. Usually fairy tales or made-up adventures. But tonight, Madison decided to tell a different story. Once upon a time, she began, there was a woman who was very scared. She was going to have a baby, and she wanted her baby to be safe. But the baby's father was not a good man, so the woman had to be very brave. Hope's eyes were already closing, but she murmured, brave like mama? Yes, baby, brave like mama. The woman made a plan. She told people the truth about the bad things the father had done, and because she was brave, her baby grew up safe and happy. Happy, Hope repeated, drifting into sleep. Madison sat by her daughter's bed for a long time, watching her breathe. 2.5 years old, Hope would never remember the safe house, the trial, the reporters. She'd grow up in this small town with a mother who loved her, knowing only that her biological father was a bad man who was far away and could never hurt them. Someday, Hope would ask harder questions. Why did her father try to hurt them? How did Mama escape? What really happened? And Madison would tell her the truth, not to scare her, but to teach her that women are stronger than the men who tried to control them. That intelligence and planning can defeat money and power. That survival isn't weakness, it's the ultimate victory. Madison's phone buzzed. A text from Foster. Appeals denied. Derek's attorneys notified he's not getting out. Madison typed back, thank you for everything. Foster. You did this. You saved yourself. I just helped with the paperwork. Madison smiled. It was more than paperwork. Foster had believed her when she'd shown up 8 months pregnant with evidence of corporate fraud and murder, had helped stage the disappearance, had protected her through the trial. But Foster was right about one thing. Madison had saved herself. She walked to her bedroom, to the small safe she kept in the closet. Inside, copies of all the evidence, backup drives, her own insurance policy, just in case. She'd never stop being careful. But also inside the safe, Hope's baby photos, Madison's new ID documents, the deed to this house, proof of a life rebuilt. She closed the safe and looked at herself in the mirror. 34 years old now. 2 years older than the woman who'd driven to Riverside Bridge and left her car behind. 2 years stronger. 2 years free. Outside, the sun was setting. Madison walked to her back porch and sat in the rocking chair, watching the sky turn orange and pink. She thought about the question reporters always asked. Do you regret how you handled it? No regrets. She'd done what she needed to do to survive. Had she broken laws? Yes, technically. Faking her death, even coordinated with the FBI, was legally murky. But the alternative was being actually dead. Had she manipulated Derek? Absolutely. She'd set a trap and watched him walk into it. But Derek had been planning to murder her. Fair play. Had she gotten revenge? Maybe. But mostly she'd gotten justice. For herself, for the 47 victims, for Marcus Vance, for every woman who'd ever been told she was crazy when she knew danger was real. The sky darkened. Stars appeared. Madison thought about all the women out there trapped in relationships with dangerous men, afraid to leave, afraid to stay. Women who felt alone, who thought no one would believe them, who'd been convinced they were overreacting or paranoid. She thought about her book, about the interviews she'd given to help those women, about the legislation that would protect future victims, about Elena Morrison's nonprofit, providing resources for families affected by corporate crimes. Derek had wanted to silence her. Instead, she'd made sure her voice echoed everywhere. That was real victory. Inside the house, Hope called out, Mama! Madison went to her daughter. Hope had woken from a bad dream, reaching for comfort. Madison climbed into the toddler bed, held Hope close, sang softly until her daughter relaxed back into sleep. This was her life now. Small moments, ordinary days. The privilege of watching her daughter grow up safe. No cameras, no monitoring, no fear. Just life. Epilogue. The final message. 3 years after Derek's sentencing, Madison received a letter from the prison. Derek was dying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, only weeks to live. He'd requested to see Hope one time. His lawyers had filed an emergency motion for compassionate release, or at minimum, a supervised hospital visit. Madison burned the motion without responding. Derek had no right to Hope. had forfeited any claim to fatherhood the moment he'd planned to kill them both. Hope, who was 5 now, thriving in kindergarten, completely unaware that her biological father was dying in prison. She knew she had a father somewhere, but he was far away, and they didn't talk about him much. That was how Madison wanted it. When Derek died 2 months later, it made headlines for about a day. Pharmaceutical CEO dies in prison. A few paragraphs about his crimes, his trial, his sentencing, then nothing. America moved on. Madison sat Hope down and explained in simple terms. Your father passed away. Do you understand what that means? Hope thought about it. He's in heaven? He's gone. He can't hurt anyone anymore. Okay. Hope went back to her coloring book. That was all. No tears, no trauma, just okay. Because Derek had never been part of Hope's life. Just a name, a story, a cautionary tale. Madison attended Derek's funeral from a distance, just to make sure, just to see him lowered into the ground and know it was truly over. There were fewer than 10 people there. His parents estranged since the trial, 2 lawyers, a priest, no friends, no mourners, no one to remember Derek Brennan as anything but a killer. Madison stood by her car in the parking lot, watching the short ceremony, and then she drove home to Hope. That night, for the last time, Madison opened her laptop and accessed the encrypted files she'd built 5 years ago. The dead man's switch, the evidence, the trap that had saved her life. She'd kept the files as insurance, as backup, as proof. Now she deleted them. All of them, permanently, irretrievably gone. Because Derek was dead. The threat was over. Hope was safe, and Madison was finally completely free. She closed her laptop, walked to Hope's room, and watched her daughter sleep. 5 years old, beautiful, perfect, unburdened by the knowledge of what her mother had survived to protect her. Tomorrow, Madison would wake up and take Hope to school. Would work on her second book, this one about resilience rather than survival. Would have coffee with Matthews and Foster. Would live her quiet, ordinary, precious life. No more looking over her shoulder. No more fear. No more Derek. Just Madison and Hope. Just survival becoming life. Just the future opening before them. Bright and free. Madison whispered into the darkness. They say revenge destroys you. But this wasn't revenge. This was survival. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to be destroyed by someone who wants to destroy you. She kissed Hope's forehead and walked to her own bed. Outside, the world continued. But inside this small house, Madison and Hope were safe, were healing, were living, and that was the greatest victory of all.